The name of an entire era in European history was not coined by a historian. It came from one bitter poet, centuries after that era had already ended. People bathed by law and wore eyeglasses 200 years before the Renaissance. Dark was never the right word for any of it. Today, 10 of the biggest myths about medieval Europe still believed by almost everyone. What really happened back then? Let's go. Number 10. The Noble Knight. Picture the image pop culture has drilled into everyone's head. A knight trudging through the mud after a battle, mail caked in filth, breath sour, laughing at some fresh act of violence because nobody above him can stop him and no code beneath him tells him not to. A brute wrapped in steel, answering to nothing but his own appetite. That is the knight most people carry around in their heads without ever questioning it. The default setting for an entire warrior class, spanning nearly 1,000 years of European history. But walk into the world these men actually lived in, and that image starts falling apart almost immediately. Starting in the late 11th century, something began forming across the continent that was not a suggestion, not a loose set of manners passed down by polite tradition. It was a code, and it bound an entire class of armed men the way religious law bound a monk: courage under fire, loyalty to a sworn lord, justice toward the powerless, mercy for anyone who could not defend themselves, generosity even toward enemies who had already lost, good manners at a feasting table, and equally strict manners on a battlefield. Most modern audiences imagine as pure chaos. None of this stayed as a vague ideal whispered around a campfire and forgotten by morning. By the 14th and 15th centuries, chivalry had hardened into formal institutions with membership rolls, oaths, and ceremonies, the medieval equivalent of a professional licensing board for violence. England built the Order of the Garter around it. Burgundy built the Order of the Golden Fleece. These were not vague fraternities. They were selective, prestigious, and deeply political. The Duke of Burgundy himself once sat down and wrote out exactly what a true knight was supposed to embody, a list of 12 specific virtues rather than a hazy feeling of honor: faith, justice, prudence, temperance, truth, valor, hope, among others. This reads less like a poem and more like a job description, the kind handed to a man before he was trusted with a sword and a title. Picture the ceremony that made a knight in the first place. A young man kneeling through an entire night-long vigil inside a cold stone chapel, his armor laid out in front of him like evidence waiting to be judged, swearing an oath out loud in front of witnesses who would remember every single word if he ever broke it. That was not decoration. That was how an entire society tried to take raw physical strength and bolt a conscience onto it before handing it a weapon. Tournaments worked the same way. Far from lawless brawls, they ran on dense rulebooks specifying who could fight whom, with which weapons, under which conditions of honor, refereed in front of crowds of nobility who were watching for exactly one thing: a man's character under pressure. Break the rules in front of that crowd, and you were not simply beaten in a fight. You were disgraced in front of the entire aristocracy, a humiliation that could follow a man for the rest of his life, far more painfully than any physical wound. Then came the literature, which did more to cement the ideal than any single tournament ever could. Courtly romance, the Chanson's digest, turned the knight into a genuine cultural obsession. An entire genre built around men who rescued the helpless and loved with restraint rather than conquest. This is where damsels in distress and courtly love as concepts were essentially invented, exported so successfully across the centuries that they still quietly shape how modern audiences picture romance itself. 700 years later, often without anyone realizing where the template came from. Here is the detail worth sitting with. Membership in the Order of the Garter was never a costume or a badge handed out for show. It carried real political status, comparable to holding an actual title at the royal court. Kings used it to bind alliances between rival houses. Nobles competed for a place inside it, the same way they competed for land, castles, and marriages. A code built around personal virtue had quietly become one of the most valuable currencies of power in the entire kingdom. Historians, to their credit, do not pretend every knight lived up to any of this. Plenty broke the code the moment gold or land landed on the table in front of them, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of myth-making. But that honest admission does not erase the code. It actually proves the opposite of the popular myth. Nobody writes 12 formal virtues, builds religious ceremonies, funds royal orders, and manufactures an entire literary genre to control men who already have no rules worth breaking in the first place. You build all of that specifically because the raw material underneath, trained fighters with weapons and no natural limits, was dangerous enough that an entire civilization decided it needed restraining, on purpose, in public, for centuries. And there is a second layer worth noticing underneath the first. The savage, lawless knight that modern audiences picture so easily is not really a medieval invention at all. It is largely a much later reconstruction, built by generations of storytellers who needed the past to look cruder and more chaotic than the present, so that progress itself would have somewhere clean to start from. The genuinely documented version, oaths, orders, 12 written virtues, and a literary tradition that outlived the knights themselves by centuries, is considerably stranger and more disciplined than the fantasy that eventually replaced it in the popular imagination. So the noble knight was never some later romantic invention layered backward onto history for comfort. It was closer to the opposite, a real, enforced, literary and political structure, built directly on top of men that society openly worried might otherwise become exactly the savage the myth insists they always were anyway. But if an entire warrior class could be handed a formal written code of virtue, table manners, and personal philosophy, and made to answer for it in front of kings, what does that tell you about the ordinary people everyone still assumes could not even read their own names, let alone argue philosophy or law? That assumption is next, and it collapses even faster than this one did. Number 9. The Illiterate Age. Say the words Dark Ages out loud, and a picture forms almost on its own. Centuries of near-total illiteracy, an entire continent that simply forgot how to read. A handful of monks maybe scratching a few lines by candlelight while everyone else lived and died, without ever touching a written word. But walk into a monastery courtyard or a cathedral school anywhere in early medieval Europe, and that comfortable picture starts falling apart immediately. These schools were not occasional, accidental pockets of learning scattered here and there by luck. They ran continuous, structured education stretching back to the earliest centuries of the period, teaching grammar, logic, scripture, and the foundational skills that would eventually grow into something far larger than anyone inside those first classrooms could have imagined. Out of that same soil grew the first universities anywhere on Earth, and they were not loose gatherings of curious monks. They were formal, chartered institutions with a documented history you can still trace today, brick by brick, charter by charter. Bologna came first, founded in 1088, built around the study of law, and still widely recognized today as the oldest university on the planet. Paris followed not long after, forming around 1150, organized around theology. Oxford came together not far behind it, around 1167. None of these were religious schools quietly training a handful of monks in some back room, invisible to the wider world. They were self-governing corporations, essentially guilds of students and masters who negotiated their own legal rights, set their own academic standards, and answered to neither the church nor the crown in matters of internal governance. An almost shocking level of institutional independence for supposedly the darkest stretch of European history. These universities had structured faculties covering law, theology, and medicine. They had entrance standards, formal examinations, earned degrees, and a functioning academic bureaucracy that would look strangely familiar to anyone who has ever filled out enrollment paperwork at a modern university. Picture a master lecturing in Latin to a packed hall of students who had traveled from entirely different kingdoms just to sit and listen, arguing fine points of law and philosophy late into the evening by candlelight, defending a formal thesis in front of examiners who could end an entire career with one bad mark on one bad day. That is not the scene of an illiterate, incurious world stumbling through centuries of ignorance. That is the scene of an institution deliberately built to manufacture literate, argumentative, credentialed professionals, generation after generation, century after century. Here is the detail worth sitting with. The University of Bologna, founded in 1088, is older than the discovery of America by roughly 400 years. It did not flicker briefly into existence and vanish into some dark century, waiting to be rediscovered later by more enlightened minds. It has operated continuously since its founding, straight through plagues, wars, and entire empires rising and collapsing around its walls, and it is still teaching students today in the same city, under a name that has not changed. That is not the fingerprint of a dark age stumbling through ignorance. That is one of the longest unbroken institutional lifespans anywhere in recorded human history. There is a deeper layer sitting just beneath that one, though. The myth of universal illiteracy did not just underestimate how many medieval people could read. It quietly erased an entire infrastructure of formal thought, one that trained lawyers, theologians, and physicians using methods of structured argument and examined evidence, the same intellectual scaffolding that would eventually hold up the legal and scientific systems the modern world still runs on without a second thought. Calling that stretch of history dark does not just insult the people who actually lived through it and built these institutions with their own hands. It quietly hides just how much of our own modern intellectual furniture was already standing, fully assembled, centuries before anyone got around to calling the next era a Renaissance. And there is something almost funny about how that erasure happened in the first place. The label came from people who considered themselves the enlightened ones looking backward, deciding that anything built before their own moment simply could not have been as sophisticated as what they were building now. It is far easier to feel like a golden age arriving out of nowhere when the previous several centuries have been quietly rebranded as darkness, whether or not the actual universities, law codes, and lecture halls agree with that verdict. Of course, none of this means every peasant in some distant, isolated village could sit down and read a manuscript purely for pleasure on a rainy afternoon. Literacy was uneven, concentrated heavily in cities, in the clergy, and among the educated classes who could afford the years of schooling it required. But uneven access to books across a very large continent is a fundamentally different claim than universal, civilization-wide ignorance. And the enormous gap between those two ideas is exactly where the myth of the illiterate age quietly falls apart under its own weight, which raises an uncomfortable question worth sitting with for a moment. If people could organize entire universities, negotiate their own legal charters, and argue theology by candlelight in front of examiners who held their careers in their hands, why does everyone still assume, almost automatically, that these same people were too disgusting and unwashed to bother building basic hygiene into daily life at all? That particular myth might be the most stubborn one on this entire list, and it is exactly what comes next. Number 8. The Filthy Peasant. Close your eyes and picture the standard medieval peasant of popular imagination, crusted in dirt from years of neglect, genuinely terrified of water, never once in an entire lifetime touching a bar of soap, living inside a society that apparently never once occurred to bathe. But start walking through an actual medieval town from the 12th century onward, and you keep running into the exact same building on nearly every street corner you turn, the public bathhouse. These were not rare luxuries reserved for royalty behind palace walls. They existed in something close to every sizable medieval town across Europe, ordinary civic infrastructure, as expected as a marketplace or a church. People used them constantly enough that some towns eventually took the matter completely out of personal choice. In certain places, residents who skipped the bathhouse for too long could actually be fined by local authorities because cleanliness was treated as a matter of civic order, not a private lifestyle preference left up to individual taste. Soap itself was not some rare miracle waiting to be discovered later in history by more advanced minds. It was being made at home and sold as an entirely ordinary trade good as far back as the 9th century, produced from animal fat and ash, then scented with sage or thyme to cut the harsher smell of the base ingredients. For those who wanted something finer than the household version, luxury soap arrived through crusaders and merchants traveling routes stretching all the way back to the Middle East, carried home like any other prized good alongside spices, silk, and dyes. Monasteries built bathing directly into their formal rule of daily life, with monks washing several times a month as a matter of religious discipline rather than personal indulgence. Nobility, meanwhile, kept private baths built directly into their own chambers, heated and staffed, ready whenever they wanted them, a level of everyday comfort that quietly contradicts the entire filthy medieval stereotype on its own. Here is the detail worth sitting with. In some medieval towns, missing your weekly visit to the public bathhouse was not simply frowned upon by disapproving neighbors. It could actually cost you money, enforced in much the same way a modern city might fine a resident today for ignoring a basic building code or sanitation ordinance. Hygiene was not merely tolerated in medieval Europe, treated as an occasional nicety for those who could afford it. In places, it was written directly into local law. So where did the filthy peasant image actually come from, if not from the Middle Ages itself? Mostly from later centuries. During plague outbreaks, a very specific new fear spread alongside the disease itself, the belief that hot water opened the pores of the skin and allowed sickness to pour in more easily through them. People genuinely began bathing less during those crisis years, not out of some inherited medieval ignorance about hygiene, but out of a desperate, medically misguided attempt at caution in the middle of a terrifying epidemic. That particular shift happened after the genuine golden age of the bathhouse, not throughout the entire medieval period as popular memory now assumes. And it is more than a little telling that this one narrow exception eventually swallowed the reputation of an entire 1,000 years of history. There is a sharper layer sitting underneath this one too. The stink of the filthy medieval peasant was not really born in the Middle Ages at all. It was largely manufactured centuries afterward, by people looking backward and needing the past to appear primitive and unwashed, so that their own present could look civilized and advanced by direct comparison. Convince enough people that an entire era smelled bad, and it becomes remarkably easy to dismiss everything else that era accomplished, without ever looking closely enough to check. And once you notice how many of these particular myths were constructed after the fact, by people with their own reasons for making the past look worse than the evidence actually supports, a much larger question quietly opens up. If knights were operating under sworn honor codes, if universities had already been running continuously for centuries, if entire towns were fining residents for skipping a weekly bath, then what does that tell you about the other assumption almost nobody ever bothers to question? The one insisting that women in this same period had no rights, no power, and no voice of any kind at all. That particular assumption is about to get a great deal more complicated than anyone expects. But grooming was never the whole story people got wrong about this era. Walk out of the bathhouse, past the market stalls and into the great hall of a castle, and there is an even bigger, more stubborn myth waiting to collapse, this one about who in that hall actually held the power. Number 7. The Powerless Woman. Picture a battlefield in northern Italy. Banners snapping in the wind, foot soldiers forming up in the mud, and standing at the front of it all not a duke, not a king, but a woman in full plate armor, giving the orders herself. That image does not fit the standard picture of medieval womanhood most people carry around without ever really questioning it. In that picture, a woman is property first and a person second, handed from a father to a husband, with no voice in politics, no control over money, and certainly no place anywhere near a battlefield. She exists in the story only to be rescued or married off, or both. But history did not actually run that cleanly, and one single, thoroughly documented life is enough to shatter the entire image on its own. Her name was Matilda of Tuscany. She was born in 1046, and by the time she died, she had spent roughly 40 consecutive years doing something the popular myth insists no medieval woman ever did. She personally commanded armies in the field. Not from behind castle walls, not through a husband quietly issuing orders in her name, but standing in armor herself, deciding strategy, leading soldiers into actual combat, campaign after campaign, decade after decade. At the height of her power, she controlled most of central and northern Italy, one of the largest personal territories held by anyone in the region at that time, man or woman. Vassals answered to her directly. Bishops corresponded with her as a genuine power in her own right. Rivals negotiated with her the same way they would negotiate with any king. She used that authority to defend the Pope himself, throwing her territory, her soldiers, and her own personal safety behind one side of one of the most dangerous political conflicts of the entire medieval period. A struggle between emperors and popes that was tearing the continent apart over who truly held ultimate authority on earth. Picture what that actually meant in practice. In a world supposedly obsessed with keeping women decorative, silent, and safely indoors, one noblewoman instead spent 4 decades standing in a war camp, making decisions about troop movements, alliances, and territory that powerful men were forced to respect, whether they liked taking orders from her or not. Historians studying her long uprising against the rigid feudal order around her have gone even further, describing her rebellion as one of the seeds that eventually helped grow the Italian Renaissance, generations after she herself was gone. And here is the twist most retellings conveniently leave out. The story usually told about the birth of that Renaissance credits merchants, popes, and male scholars quietly rebuilding classical learning, brick by brick, in libraries and workshops. Rarely does it mention a woman on horseback, in a war zone, shaping the political ground that made all of that rebuilding possible in the first place. The detail worth sitting with is this: a woman in full armor, personally leading soldiers into battle for 40 straight years, inside an era supposedly defined from top to bottom by female powerlessness. That is not folklore passed down at a campfire. That is a documented reign longer than most kings of her century ever managed to hold onto a crown. And Matilda was not some isolated miracle, sealed off from the rest of medieval society, an exception invented purely to prove a rule. Abbesses across Europe ran monastic estates that in size rivaled small kingdoms, controlling land, controlling tenants, controlling income, and wielding real influence over religious and political matters that reached far beyond the walls of their own convent. Queens stepped in as regents, ruling in the name of an absent king or an underage heir. Some governed for years as widows, managing vast estates and entire courts of officials on behalf of sons still far too young to hold real authority themselves, quietly running the actual machinery of a territory long before anyone was willing to officially credit them with running it. Others ruled outright in their own name, whenever the throne demanded it, and no male heir stood in the way at all. Inheritance law for women varied enormously from region to region across the continent, sometimes generous, sometimes harsh, but never the flat, universal image so many people carry around today, a single blank rule insisting women owned nothing, inherited nothing, and decided nothing. So why does almost none of this survive in the popular picture? Why does the armored regent get quietly dropped from the story while the veiled, silent bride gets remembered as the whole truth? Whose version of the era actually got written down, and who's got left out of it entirely? None of this means medieval women had equal standing with men across the board. That would just be its own myth, painted in the opposite color and just as dishonest. What actually happened was messier and far more interesting than either extreme. Gaps opened up by war, by death, by sudden political vacuum, and certain women stepped directly into those gaps and held the line for years, sometimes for decades, sometimes long after the original crisis that had put them there was over and forgotten by everyone else. And that is really the quiet joke buried inside this entire myth. Powerlessness was never simply a fact of biology in this era. It was a story, written down mostly by men, about whose actions were considered worth recording for later generations in the first place. Matilda mattered anyway for 40 years, whether the official record of her century wanted to admit it or not. But if a woman could personally command armies for 40 years and still get quietly erased from the popular imagination centuries later, imagine what happened to an entire profession that genuinely saved lives, generation after generation, and still somehow got remembered instead as leeches, mumbled prayers, and superstition. Number 6. The Quack Doctors. Picture a sick room in a walled medieval town. A physician leans over a patient, applies a handful of leeches to the arm, mutters a short prayer, checks a chart of the stars for the day, and calls the entire routine treatment. That is the image most people carry around for medieval medicine as a whole. No science, no anatomy, no genuine understanding of the human body, just superstition dressed up in a long robe and a serious expression. But walk south, into the town of Salerno, on the coast of southern Italy, and that entire picture falls apart almost immediately. The Scuola Medica Salernitana grew out of a hospital tradition reaching back to the 9th century, centuries before the myth insists any real medicine existed at all. Over time, it became the first genuinely scientific medical institution anywhere in Europe. Its physicians performed actual anatomical dissections, including dissections of pigs, specifically to understand how muscle, organ, and bone truly connected and functioned together inside a living body, not simply to guess at it from old manuscripts alone. Its scholars produced one of the earliest European anatomical texts, built from direct observation of the body itself, rather than inherited superstition passed down unquestioned from one generation to the next. And in a detail that quietly overturns half the myth on its own, Salerno was the one school in the whole of Europe that officially trained and accepted women as licensed physicians. The most famous among them, Trocula de Ruggiero, produced medical writing on the health of women that kept circulating across the continent for centuries after her own death. That detail alone should stop the myth in its tracks. If medieval medicine really were nothing but blind superstition, there would be no reason for an institution to organize entrance standards, structured teaching, and a formal curriculum specifically around training female physicians, centuries before most of the world would even allow women to hold that title again. Superstition does not build a curriculum. Superstition does not train specialists and send them back out into the world to practice. The rigor only sharpens further from there. Starting in 1231, an edict known as the Constitutions of Melfi, issued across the whole kingdom of Sicily by the Emperor Frederick II, required every aspiring physician to pass a public examination before the masters of Salerno itself, testing their knowledge of Hippocrates, Galen, and Avicenna, and it even mandated a formal human dissection once every 5 years, so the teaching itself never drifted too far from the real, physical body. A few decades later, in 1315, the University of Bologna pushed the practice further still, when the physician Mondino de Luzzi carried out one of the first fully documented public dissections of an actual human corpse anywhere in Europe, not a pig standing in for one. Picture that exam for a moment. A candidate stands before a panel of senior physicians, expected to explain and defend medical reasoning drawn from 3 separate written traditions, in public, fully aware that failure meant no license to practice medicine anywhere in the region. That is not a coin flip decided by astrology charts and a muttered prayer. That is a licensing exam that would not look wildly out of place walking into a modern medical school. And then there is the detail that outlasts everything else on this list, the one still quietly shaping the world today. In 1377, the city of Ragusa, now known as Dubrovnik, became the first place on earth to pass a law demanding that every arriving traveler be isolated for 30 days before being allowed to enter the city, specifically to stop the plague from spreading any further. Picture what that law actually meant on the ground. Ships from plague-touched ports sat anchored offshore for a full month, crews and cargo held back from the docks, no matter how much money or status was aboard, because the city had decided that a killer nobody could even see was still worth taking seriously. The city council made that decision on the 27th of July, 1377. By 1390, Ragusa had gone even further, establishing what many historians consider the first permanent public health institution anywhere in recorded history. Here is the detail that lands hardest of all. The word quarantine comes directly from that policy, from the Italian word for 40. The number of days the original 30 was later expanded to. Every single time that word gets used today, in every country, during every outbreak the modern world has faced, it is quietly repeating a decision made by one medieval city council reacting to the Black Death. And here is the deeper layer underneath the joke about leeches and bad luck. The very civilization mocked for pure superstition is the one that noticed, centuries before anyone understood what a virus even was, that isolating the sick could stop an invisible killer from spreading further. They did not understand why it worked at the microscopic level. They observed it happening again and again in the real world, and then legislated it into law across an entire city, which, stripped of the microscope and the modern vocabulary, is exactly what science actually does. So how many other quietly brilliant medieval decisions are still sitting buried under that same tired old joke about bloodletting and bad luck, simply waiting for someone to actually look? So the doctors of this era were not fools bleeding patients by candlelight and calling it science. But treating the sick was one problem. Understanding the universe itself was another problem entirely. And there is an even bigger myth waiting on that front, one that paints the entire medieval mind as having gone completely silent for a full 1,000 years. Number 5. The silent science. Picture a monk standing outside before dawn, his breath visible in the cold air, eyes fixed on the sky, carefully tracking the position of a handful of stars against the horizon, because an entire religious calendar observed across the whole of Europe depends on him getting the math exactly right. That is not the picture most people carry around for medieval science. The usual myth is blunter and much lazier than that. Between the fall of Rome and the dawn of the Renaissance, nothing happened. 1,000 years of intellectual silence. No discoveries, no curiosity, no real science of any kind. Just a long, dim waiting room before humanity finally woke back up on its own. But the universities built during this supposedly silent stretch tell a very different story. They taught something called natural philosophy as its own dedicated subject, the medieval name for what would eventually become the natural sciences. This was not a casual hobby squeezed in between prayers. It sat on the official curriculum alongside law, theology, and medicine, taught by trained faculty to students who were tested on it, inside institutions that kept functioning year after year, generation after generation, for centuries without any real interruption. Scholars including Thomas Aquinas worked within, and actively built upon, an already established understanding that the earth was a sphere, and that the heavens moved according to describable, predictable patterns, ideas inherited from antiquity and developed further, not buried and quietly forgotten the way the myth insists. That single detail alone should already unsettle the whole story. If the continent had genuinely lost the thread of scientific thought, there would be nothing left for scholars centuries later to inherit, question, and build further upon in the first place. Nobody develops an idea that nobody remembers. Inside monasteries, monks carried out real observational astronomy, tracking the movement of celestial bodies to calculate the church calendar with genuine precision, year after year, generation after generation of quiet, careful record-keeping. That same intellectual and mechanical effort spilled directly into engineering, as the practical science behind building mills evolved gradually into an entire discipline of mechanics, gears, ratios, and moving parts calculated and refined across generations of builders who never once met each other. And that mechanical knowledge did not stay locked away inside monastery walls or abstract calculation alone. It eventually produced tangible technology that required real theoretical grounding just to exist at all. Eyeglasses themselves, an object nobody today thinks twice about slipping onto their own face, could not have been invented without centuries of accumulated understanding in both mechanics and optics. Without that so-called dark, silent age of learning, the tools of the coming scientific revolution would have had nothing solid left to stand on. Follow that chain all the way through, one link at a time. Astronomy accurate enough to run a religious calendar observed across an entire continent. Mechanics precise enough to eventually build reliable clockwork. Optics developed enough to correct human eyesight itself. None of those things exist in isolation from each other. Each one depends on decades, sometimes centuries, of people paying close attention to the physical world and writing down exactly what they learned, so the next generation could build further instead of quietly starting over from nothing. The detail that lands hardest here is almost absurd once you actually see it clearly. The universities of Oxford and Paris had the motion of the heavens and the rules of formal logic sitting on their official curriculum long before Copernicus was even born. The supposed empty centuries were, in fact, quietly doing the homework for the scientific revolution that everyone later credited to a much later age entirely. Think about what that actually requires you to believe. The idea of a full 1,000-year gap between antiquity and the Renaissance only works if an entire continent simply stopped thinking, stopped observing, stopped building for 10 straight centuries, and then somehow woke up one morning with universities, mechanical clocks, and trained astronomers already fully formed out of nowhere. Ideas do not appear like that. Someone has to carry them forward, generation after generation, by hand, or they die out completely and permanently. So which is the real fantasy here? A continent of scholars quietly building toward a revolution, one careful observation at a time, generation after patient generation, or the comic book version where an entire civilization mysteriously forgot how to think for 10 centuries and then, one convenient morning, simply remembered. But here is the deeper layer underneath all of it. The myth of a silent, sleeping mind was never really about the universities, or the monks, or the mills at all. It was about erasing the intelligence of an entire civilization down into a single convenient word, so that everything that came afterward could look like it had sprung from nothing. 1,000 years of careful, deliberate thought got flattened down into a punchline about darkness. And if an entire scientific tradition can be erased this easily, in the space of one lazy sentence, imagine what happens to a single, much simpler fact about the actual shape of the world itself. A fact that supposedly terrified and confused an entire continent for 1,000 straight years. But if the universities of Paris and Oxford were quietly teaching the shape of the heavens centuries before anyone called it science, and if scholars like Thomas Aquinas worked from an accepted, settled understanding that the earth was round, then the biggest, loudest myth about medieval ignorance is about to fall apart completely. The one almost everyone alive today still believes without ever once questioning it. Number 4. The flat earth. Picture the scene that most people already carry around in their heads, whether they ever studied history or not. A cramped room full of frightened priests and stubborn Spanish scholars, gathered around a table, staring at Christopher Columbus as though he has just proposed something close to heresy. Somebody warns him that if his ships sail far enough to the west, they will simply reach the edge of the world and fall off it. It is one of the most repeated images in all of popular history. A lone visionary explorer standing against an entire ignorant age. A whole continent of medieval Europeans who supposedly, genuinely believed the earth was flat. That meeting never happened, and the belief behind it never existed either, at least not among anyone whose opinion actually mattered. Educated Europeans across the medieval period inherited something far older and far more settled than modern audiences tend to assume. Ancient Greek astronomers had already worked out that the earth was a sphere, and that understanding passed down through Roman scholarship, and then into the monasteries and cathedral schools of early medieval Europe, where it was simply taught as background knowledge, the same way a modern classroom teaches that the earth orbits the sun. It was not a theory still being argued over. It was not a fringe position fighting for survival against superstition. It was a basic, accepted fact, repeated in whatever passed for natural philosophy wherever it was taught, centuries before Columbus was even born, let alone before he ever boarded a ship. A handful of writers across 1,000 years of medieval scholarship did occasionally argue otherwise, and historians know exactly who they were, because there were so few of them that each one stands out individually in the record. They were fringe voices, not the mainstream, and everyone at the time treated them that way, the same way a handful of modern conspiracy theorists do not represent what the rest of the educated world actually believes. So if the medieval world was not the source of the flat earth myth, where did it actually come from? The answer is not vague. It comes down to two specific, identifiable men, writing many centuries after the fact, neither of them a medieval person at all. In 1834, a French scholar named Antoine-Jean Letron published a study arguing that the early church fathers, writing in the first centuries after Rome fell, held crude, primitive, flat earth views of the cosmos. Later historians who went back and reread the same sources Letron used have heavily disputed his interpretation, arguing he misread or overstated what those early Christian writers actually believed. But by the time historians pushed back, the idea was already loose in the wider culture, repeated far more often than it was ever questioned. Then, in 1828, An American writer named Washington Irving released a biography of Columbus that read far more like an adventure novel than like careful history, dressed up just enough to be mistaken for the real thing. Irving invented, seemingly out of nothing but his own storytelling instincts, a dramatic scene in which a panel of Spanish scholars and advisors lectures Columbus, warning him solemnly that his ships will sail straight off the edge of a flat world if he keeps heading west. It is a wonderful piece of narrative tension. It is also almost entirely fiction. The real debate that took place at the Spanish court was never about the shape of the earth at all. Every educated person sitting in that room already agreed, without argument, that the earth was round. The actual disagreement was about its size, about how many miles of open ocean truly separated Europe from Asia sailing west, and about whether any ship and crew of the period could physically survive a voyage that long before running out of food and fresh water. Here is the detail worth holding onto long after this video ends. The flat earth was never a medieval belief that modern science eventually swept aside. It was a 19th century novelist's invention, stitched carefully into a fictional meeting that never took place, and later generations mistook that invented scene for settled historical fact simply because it made such a satisfying story. A storyteller sitting down to write an entertaining adventure book about Columbus accidentally rewrote how the entire modern world remembers an era that had already worked out the true shape of the planet 500 years earlier, and had gotten it right the whole time. And if one writer, working from nothing but a good imagination, could convince the modern world that medieval people believed something they never actually believed, then the next myth on this list should worry you even more. This time it is not a single invented scene tucked inside one biography. It is supposedly an entire era frozen solid, nothing built, nothing improved, nothing invented for 1,000 years running. Number 3. Frozen progress. The image attached to this myth is almost comforting in how simple it sounds. Rome falls, and human ingenuity just stops cold. No new tools worth mentioning. No real machines. No meaningful advances of any kind. An entire continent standing still for 1,000 years until the Renaissance finally, dramatically switches the lights back on, and civilization remembers how to think again. But medieval Europe was not standing still for even a single one of those centuries. It was quietly assembling the machinery that the modern world still quietly depends on today. Start down in the fields, where the real revolution actually began. Farmers across medieval Europe replaced the old, light scratch plow, a tool that barely scraped the surface of the soil, with a heavy-wheeled plow strong enough to cut deep through the thick, wet clay soils that cover so much of northern Europe. That single shift in tool design turned land that had been essentially useless for serious farming into some of the most productive farmland anywhere on the continent. Alongside it came a rigid horse collar, a deceptively small piece of shaped leather and wood that solved a problem nobody before this period had managed to solve. The old harness design pressed directly against a horse's windpipe, and the harder the animal pulled, the more it choked itself, which meant horses could never be worked anywhere near their true strength. The new rigid collar rested on the shoulders instead, distributing the load properly, and almost overnight a horse could be worked as hard as an ox while moving significantly faster across a field. Layer on top of that a three-field system of crop rotation, which kept soil fertile year after year instead of exhausting it, and you have the outline of an agricultural revolution that fed a steadily growing population without a single piece of modern machinery anywhere in sight. Then look at what medieval engineers did with nothing more than moving water and moving air. Water mills spread across the countryside, and each one did roughly the work of 20 horses, without ever tiring, without ever needing to be fed or rested. They ground grain into flour, sawed timber into planks, pounded raw wool into finished cloth, and hammered softened iron under mechanical trip hammers, all without a single human arm providing the actual muscle. Vertical windmills followed soon after, harnessing a resource that never needed feeding at all. The earliest clearly documented example stood in Yorkshire, recorded in 1185, evidence that medieval engineers had already worked out how to convert wind into steady mechanical force centuries before anyone thought to write poetry about industrial progress. That same accumulated mechanical expertise, the gears, the counterweights, the careful timing mechanisms first developed for mills, eventually produced the first mechanical clocks, which spread rapidly across European towns through the 1300s and permanently changed how ordinary people organized an entire day, no longer bound purely to sunrise and sunset. And then there is the invention that almost nobody today credits to this supposedly frozen era at all: eyeglasses. Sometime around 1280, in the Italian city of Pisa, an unknown craftsman, very likely a monk working with early glassmaking techniques, figured out how to grind glass into lenses precise enough to bring a blurry page of text back into sharp focus. Historians are able to date the invention with unusual confidence because a preacher named Fra Giordano da Pisa mentioned it directly in a sermon delivered in 1306, telling his congregation plainly that not even 20 years had passed since the art of making eyeglasses had first been discovered. That is a contemporary witness, dating the invention almost to the year, from inside the same century it happened. Here is the detail that should genuinely stop you. The original inventor of eyeglasses deliberately hid his own name and guarded the secret of how to make them, treating the process the way a modern company might guard a valuable trade secret, because the technology itself was considered that commercially precious. 1,000 years of supposed total silence, and it quietly produced the heavy plow, the rigid horse collar, the water mill doing the work of 20 horses, the windmill standing in a Yorkshire field, the mechanical clock ticking in a town square, and the very eyeglasses that might be resting on your own face at this exact moment. If medieval hands could quietly invent the machines that still hold up the modern world, imagine what medieval law could get away with when almost nobody in power was watching closely enough to write any of it down properly. Because the next myth on this list is not about a machine at all. It is about a supposed right that let one powerful man do almost anything he wanted with someone else's family, on the single most private night of their entire life. Number 2. The Lord's Right. Here is the version almost everyone has heard at least once, usually delivered as a shocking, half-whispered aside at exactly the point in a conversation about the medieval world where people expect to be scandalized. In feudal Europe, the story goes, a lord supposedly held a formal legal right to spend the first night with any peasant bride living on his land, before her own husband ever touched her. It shows up in movies. It shows up in casual conversation. It shows up in documentaries that should really know better, treated again and again as one of the ugliest, most taken for granted, most obviously true facts about the entire medieval world. But historians who have gone looking, seriously and repeatedly, for the actual law behind that claim have found nothing at all. Not one surviving document, not a single medieval legal code contains it, anywhere in Europe in any century. Not one surviving charter grants such a right to any lord. Not one church decree condemns it either, which matters enormously, because a real practice that violated marriage and morality on this scale would almost certainly have drawn furious, repeated condemnation from bishops determined to stamp it out. The exact kind of paper trail that survives for countless other medieval abuses. Not one court record anywhere shows a single peasant contesting it. Not one legal glossary from the period even bothers to define the term, which is exactly what you would expect if the thing being described never actually existed as a functioning legal right in the first place. The historian Elaine Burrow spent years combing carefully through the surviving archives, specifically hunting for any solid evidence that this so-called right had ever existed in practice. His conclusion, after all that searching, was blunt and unambiguous. It never existed as an actual, enforceable law anywhere in medieval Europe. What did exist instead was a useful story, and it turned out to be useful to more than one group of people, for more than one reason, across more than one century. Late medieval monarchs found it politically convenient to accuse rival local feudal lords of secretly holding this right, painting those lords as petty tyrants abusing their own peasants, which helped justify pulling power away from the nobility and centralizing it in the hands of the crown instead. Centuries later, long after the medieval period had actually ended, writers and propagandists gathered around the French Revolution reached for the exact same story all over again, using it as supposed proof of the deep moral corruption and casual cruelty of the entire aristocratic system they were determined to overthrow. And the term itself barely even existed in ordinary language until the 1700s, popularized above all by writers of the Enlightenment, Voltaire prominent among them, who were arguing forcefully against the old political order of their own century, not describing anything that had actually happened as documented fact hundreds of years earlier in the world of knights and manors. Sit with that for a moment, because it deserves to sink in properly. The single most repeated piece of feudal cruelty in all of popular memory has no legal source anywhere, no surviving court case anywhere, and not one contemporary document anywhere in the entire medieval record. It was a political weapon, first swung by ambitious kings against their own troublesome nobles, then swung again, centuries later, by revolutionaries against the very idea of monarchy and aristocracy itself. And both times, the frightened medieval peasant bride standing at the emotional center of the story was invented for the occasion, not remembered from any real event that anyone could point to. If a right that never once existed on paper could still convince centuries of ordinary people that it was solid, documented medieval fact, then everything you assume you already know about this era rests on considerably shakier ground than you probably realized 5 minutes ago. And there is one myth left on this list, bigger than any single invented law or any single invented belief, because it is not really about something people supposedly did during the Middle Ages at all. It is about what we all decided much later to call the entire era in the first place, who actually made that decision, and why they made it. Number 1. The Dark Ages. Say the words Dark Ages out loud, and they land like a verdict, not like an opinion, as though 1,000 careful historians independently weighed centuries of hard evidence and arrived, soberly, at the same unavoidable conclusion. Plague, ignorance, collapse. An entire millennium the human race would rather quietly forget ever happened. Most people simply assume the label describes what genuinely occurred, summarized honestly in 2 blunt words by careful, disinterested scholarship. But the name was never a scholarly conclusion, reached after weighing evidence. It was the mood of one specific, wounded, disappointed man, writing in the 1330s, for reasons that had almost nothing to do with plagues, castles, harvests, or kings. His name was Francesco Petrarca, known to history today simply as Petrarch, an Italian scholar and poet who adored classical Rome with the kind of longing usually reserved for a lost golden age nobody currently alive ever actually experienced firsthand. To Petrarch, antiquity was an age of light, and notice carefully what that judgment was actually based on. Not because Roman roads were well paved, or because Roman armies won their wars, or because Roman law kept order across an enormous empire. It was an age of light to him because Roman writers had produced Latin literature that Petrarch personally considered magnificent, elegant, endlessly worth imitating on the page. And everything that came after the fall of Rome, in Petrarch's own private judgment, including the very century he himself happened to be living through, was an age of darkness, not because civilization itself had visibly collapsed around him, because, in his own personal literary opinion, nobody around him seemed to be writing good Latin anymore. His own libraries felt thinner than he wanted them to be. His favorite classical texts felt harder to track down, and worse understood by the scholars he actually knew than he believed they deserved. That very specific, very personal disappointment, one poet quietly mourning the literary fashions of his own particular lifetime, is the actual seed of a phrase that would eventually grow large enough to swallow an entire 1,000-year stretch of human history. It was never an economic assessment. It was never a careful survey of technology, or agriculture, or medicine, or law. The very categories this list has spent the last several minutes proving were quietly thriving the entire time. Plows turning heavier soil, water mills doing the work of 20 horses, universities training lawyers and physicians, eyeglasses correcting blurred vision 2 centuries before anyone associates progress with this era at all. It was one gifted, frustrated writer grading an entire era on the quality of its poetry alone, and deciding, on that single narrow basis, that it had failed. And here is where the story turns genuinely uncomfortable, because that private grade stuck, and it kept sticking, generation after generation, for centuries afterward. Petrarch's own personal, literary mood slowly hardened into a label. That label eventually became a chapter title in later history books, written by authors who never stopped to question where the phrase had actually come from, or what it had originally been meant to describe. The chapter title became common knowledge, repeated from textbook to textbook, passed down from classroom to classroom, generation after generation, until nobody questioned it anymore at all, until it stopped feeling like one disappointed man's opinion and started feeling instead like a fact carved permanently into stone. Today, the overwhelming majority of professional historians consider the term Dark Ages outdated and misleading, and many of them avoid using it entirely when discussing the early medieval centuries specifically, let alone when discussing the full 1,000-year span running from 500 to 1500 that this very video has spent its whole runtime exploring. The phrase survives now mostly in casual conversation and popular imagination, not in serious academic scholarship, precisely because historians who actually study the period closely and carefully know exactly how thin the original justification for the name really was, and how little it had to do with plows, universities, watermills, or eyeglasses, which leaves you sitting with a genuinely uncomfortable question. Because if the name of the entire era, the very frame everyone alive today reaches for before they even learn a single fact about it, came from one disappointed poet's private literary preferences, and not from any careful accounting of what actually happened on the ground, then what else did you simply assume was settled fact, purely because it happened to arrive wearing a confident-sounding label? How many other pieces of supposedly common knowledge about this era are quietly resting on nothing sturdier than one long-dead person's centuries-old opinion, repeated so often, by so many people, across so many generations, that it eventually stopped sounding like an opinion at all, and started sounding instead like history itself? Look back now at everything counted down across this entire video, and a pattern starts to emerge that should genuinely unsettle you. Not one, not two, but at least 3 of the very labels examined tonight, the flat earth, the Lord's right, and the Dark Ages itself, were never medieval failures at all. Every one of them was invented, coined, or actively popularized by writers born long after the knights, the plows, the universities, and the eyeglasses they claimed, with total confidence, to be accurately describing. A 19th century novelist gave the era a flat earth belief it never actually held. Enlightenment writers gave it a wedding night, write its own courts, charters, and church records never once documented. And one heartbroken, homesick poet gave the entire 1,000 years its permanent name, based on nothing sturdier than his own personal taste in Latin verse. Not backward, not stagnant, not flat, not even properly honestly named. 10 myths, and underneath every single one of them sits the exact same quiet truth. The Middle Ages were never actually judged by the people who lived through them, day by day, working the fields, building the mills, running the universities, grinding the lenses. They were judged much later, by novelists chasing a good story, by monarchs and revolutionaries chasing a convenient villain, and by one grieving poet chasing a literary golden age that had already been gone for 1,000 years before he ever picked up his pen. Not dirty, not ignorant, not lawless, not frozen in place, not flat, not even honestly properly named by the people who actually lived it, just quietly misremembered on purpose again and again by people who arrived centuries afterward and needed the story to sound a certain way for their own reasons. So here is the honest question worth sitting with after everything you just heard. Out of all 10 of these, which single myth surprised you the most, the one you personally would have sworn was solid historical fact 5 minutes before this video started? Say it plainly in the comments, and come ready to actually defend your pick, because somewhere down in that comment section is someone who believed the exact same thing you did, right up until now, and they may not give up their own myth quite so easily. Most people hear the words Dark Ages, nod along without a second thought, and simply keep scrolling. You just sat through the entire real story instead. If you want more of the medieval world carefully rebuilt from the actual surviving evidence, instead of from the campfire version everybody already assumes they know, subscribe, because this is only the beginning of everything history quietly got wrong. Template. Subscribe.